Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians around the world. Today is Friday, August 8th, 2025. This episode of Krynytsia is produced for the Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest for this episode is Andreas Umland, who is an analyst at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs and an associate professor of political science at the National University of Kiev-Mohyly Academy in Kiev, Ukraine. Welcome, Professor Umland. How are you?
Thanks, I'm fine. Thanks for having me again. Delighted and honored.
And thank you for coming back again. So to start off with, can you give us a little bit about your educational and professional background?
I grew up in East Germany and studied later on at the Free University of West Berlin, as well as in Britain and the US. I worked mainly for the first 20 years of my studies on Russian imperial nationalism. And after my move to Ukraine in 2002, I also started researching and writing on Ukrainian domestic and foreign affairs. And for the last 3 years, I had to largely stop teaching and doing academic work, and am working now mainly for the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies and more in the fields of analysis and publicism, if you want to call it that way.
Professor, do you think the current U.S. Ukraine foreign policy of the Trump administration will deter Russian President Vladimir Putin from further escalation of the war?
As of today, 8th of August, 2025, I don't see any signs of success of Trump. He tried to first court Putin during the first months of 2025 and sent a lot of conciliatory and even laudatory signals to Moscow, to Putin. That didn't have any results. In the last weeks, he has become more resolute and has threatened sanctions. But on the whole, I think the understanding of the new White House, of the new US administration, of this war and of Russian foreign policy, Russian history in general, is low. And therefore, the approach is inadequate and can at most lead to a new temporary ceasefire. We had these temporary ceasefires already since 2014, several of them, and they usually broke down then after a while, and they did not prevent these ceasefires, the larger escalation then since 2022. And here too, I think the most we can hope for is perhaps a temporary ceasefire, and after that, the war will go on unless the U.S. administration becomes much more serious about pressuring Russia with sanctions and with weapons deliveries to Ukraine.
And what about these higher tariffs that U.S. President Trump has threatened Russia with? Today is actually a deadline for the revised tariff implementation date. Do you see them having any impact on the war, and you think they're actually going to take place?
This has been a rather strange approach from the beginning, in that the primary way here for Trump to exert pressure on Russia would not be the US itself, but rather this pressure would have to be exerted by other countries, and moreover by countries concerning sanctions that are not allied to the US, by countries like China, India, or Brazil, and that the US cannot directly influence. It can only indirectly try to motivate them to certain action. But the instruments for doing this sort of complicated scheme was inadequate. I think the approach that the Senate has taken with proposing a 500% tariff on those countries that trade with Russia would have been much more serious. But the 100% then proposed by Trump, but now the 25% of additional tariff introduced vis-à-vis India with regard to this particular sanction is not enough, is inadequate. So it seems to me that all of this is perhaps just a show for the American spectator. The problem for Trump here being that Ukraine remains a relatively popular country in the U.S., even among Republican voters, and the support of the U.S. for Ukraine is supported, the help for Ukraine is supported by many Americans, and that's why Trump is apparently trying to create the impression that he's doing something, although in fact this is very little, and it's indirect, and it's more of a show than a real material action.
I've read that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been encouraging U.S. President Trump to be more sympathetic towards Ukraine. Do you agree with that statement?
Perhaps we will know one day from the historians whether there were really such conversations. Rubio seems to be a slightly different kind of politician than, let's say, Trump and Vance, from a different background. So I can imagine that something like that has happened. But he seems to be a minor force, a minor voice in the Trump administration, and he has to follow Trump's lead rather than give him advice. So I don't think that he will have much of an impact unless the general situation changes, and unless, let's say, Trump interprets the solution of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict as something very important for his administration, then perhaps Rubio could come more to the fore. And I guess intuitively, I would say he has perhaps more sympathy for Ukraine than other members of the Trump administration.
Why did Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky try to curb the autonomy of the country's anti-corruption agencies in July?
I think that action has to be seen within the context of a general drive towards centralization of decision making and authority in Ukraine since February 2022, when the large scale Russian invasion started, martial law was introduced, and when basically Ukraine developed in a way in which many countries that are under attack, that are in war, develop. And so we had these sort of centralization tendencies in other spheres too, in mass media concerning local self-government and so on. And moreover, there is indeed the problem, and that has been the main justification for Zelensky to attempt this takeaway of the independence from two of the anti-corruption agencies, that there is indeed a problem of Russian infiltration in various Ukrainian state organs. Even the security service has been infiltrated. And so I think the motivation here was, at least that was the official narrative, that these two agencies, the Investigation Bureau on Corruption and the Procuracy on Corruption, would be put under the control of the General Procurator of Procuracy of Ukraine, and thereby be under the control of the central state and not any longer independent. And I think it was simply a mistake in that Zelensky perhaps thought that this would be a minor change in the construction of the Ukrainian state, but it was taken very seriously by Ukrainian civil society and also by the foreign Ukrainian partners, and then reversed within a few days with a new law that restored the independence of these two organs.
Professor, so overall, what impact did widespread public protest and pressure from global allies have on President Zelensky's subsequent decision to reverse the July 22nd law? restricting the work of anti-corruption agencies?
Yes, I think these factors were quite visible, and also the demonstrations were not very large, but they were large enough to be noted. They took place, by the way, under martial law. They were actually usually such demonstrations are forbidden under martial law, and also the signals from the international partners were quite clear. And then perhaps this mistake within the administration became only apparent. I'm still wondering how all of this has happened, and how and why Zelensky was given advice to do this. I think he has now damaged his reputation, above all in Ukraine. And I think if he goes for re-election, I think this episode will be remembered and will be a problem for his political biography. And the whole episode is now like basically a rather strange story, and not fully explicable to me.
So then you believe that this event has reduced confidence and trust in the Zelensky government?
Yes, I think among Ukrainians, that has certainly tarnished now Zelensky's reputation. Nevertheless, I wouldn't say that this will have an immediate effect, because this rallying around the flag effect will still be there. And since Zelensky is the president, and since there cannot be no elections during wartime, he will remain the president, and he will be respected as the president. But once we will have a permanent ceasefire, and then new presidential elections, then I think this will become a problem for him. But for the time being, this is not, I think, a major problem for him. And in any way, there is so far, no serious competitor for him. According to opinion polls, the current ambassador of Ukraine to Great Britain, Valery Zaluzhny, the former commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, would be a serious competitor for Zelensky. But Zaluzhny has not yet announced or shown any political ambition. And the other competitors of Zelensky are still even after this episode, below his rating. So for the time being, I don't think that will have a major impact for the Ukrainian government.
Professor, unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but I do have a final question. I just read this morning in the Kyiv Post that there seem to be some new efforts to remove the heads of the anti-corruption agencies in Ukraine. Do you see any evidence of this?
I haven't heard about this. Perhaps that could be true. In any way, I think it will be the same story as with this attempt to bring the agencies under central control. If the procedure for replacing the heads of anti-corruption agencies will violate the statutes of these organizations, I think there will be again an outcry, and there would be then again also international protest. I cannot imagine that really this will happen again.
Professor Umland, thank you so much for joining us today on Krynytsia.
Thanks for having me again.
I have been speaking with Professor Andreas Umland, who's an analyst at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and an associate professor of political science at the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy in Kyiv, Ukraine. This episode of Krynytsia is produced for the Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. And I'm Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia. Until next time, that's all for now.